Hello and welcome to another episode of Africa Business Weekly, where we take you on a journey to the world of business across sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Akin Obake, and this week we highlight the British High Commission's take on Nigeria's democracy as momentum builds to another phase of keenly contested elections this Saturday. And from there, we move over to East Africa, where we explore how the African Continental Free Trade Area can explore or catalyze food transport system in Africa and responses to mitigate climate shocks. But first, let's begin our conversation this week with a spotlight from South Africa. Hello, Palesa.
For another week of Pan-African coverage, we start with Africa's male-dominated private equity sector, where sector-agnostic investments such as mining, industrials, energy, and social assets read their relevance in improving Africa's sub-Saharan economic growth. As a woman leading in the sector, we spoke to Mamecha Moshe, founder and CEO at Moshe Capital. Let's listen in.
It was mainly male-dominated, but what we always prided ourselves in is bringing the skills and the experience that we have. Having come from international banks, when we came into the industry, we always made sure that we perfected our skills and experience and demonstrated that to the market. Similarly, when it came to capital raise, so we do not have a specific fund at the moment. We have we have funds from F&B Commercial, which we invest. And we also have an MOU with two other venture capital, private equity kind of companies that have given us capital of about 300 million. And it's relationship built and track record and experience. So once you have those, we found that it is much easier. In South Africa, there is a lot that is not going okay in the country right now. But when it came to transformation and South African listed corporates, their views on transformation and really putting their money behind it, we found that there is a lot of that as well. So there was support for us as a company.
So let's talk about the Pragma transaction, a 15 million rand transaction. What are you bringing to Pragma in terms of your expertise and skills and your vision for the company going forward?
Tanya, as Moshe Capital, we've always wanted, in everything we do, from our advisory to our investments, we always wanted to and always want to be a value-adding partner. When we started in 2013, which was quite ambitious at the time, we said we want to partner with African companies that we can work with to become global players and have international standards play and be able to compete globally. As a South African company. We saw that in Pragma when we came in. It is an enterprise asset manager. So in layman's terms, it's about reliability of physical assets. So if I can give an example, assuming that Pragma was at Eskom, the reliability of the various power stations would have been checked upfront and ensure that we bring the right, testing and maintenance of those assets before they actually break down. So that's a little example. We, as a value-adding partner to Pragma, bring our business strategy skills. So, we as Pragma, now talking as Pragma, we have a vision of growing outside of the borders of South Africa and entrenching ourselves more in the mining industry. So there is a lot of digitization that is involved in asset management lately, and we want to expand that. So we help in business development, in strategy, in mergers and acquisitions. So acquisitions globally to grow the company to be much bigger. And I think, the one thing that we love about Pragma and with all our investee companies is shared values. Our tagline is inclusive prosperity. We always make sure that there are employees involved in the companies we invest in, communities, and ESG is held upfront. It's the core of our investment. It is as important as our financial returns. So we see ourselves as a value-adding partner that will assist in the future growth through business strategy business development, as well as optimization and M&A.
Up next is a story on the race to net zero. To unpack what Africa's just energy transition should look like and how to leverage Africa's fossil fuel hubs while observing global net zero goals is Onyebuchi Meme, who is the Standard Chartered Bank Head of Trade in Southern Africa. For more, let's listen in.
I think the emotions are high on both sides. Clearly, you would have seen a lot of pushback from many people in Africa saying that there's pressure from the West for them to transit. Clearly, if you look at it, there's merit in the argument that Africa needs a lot more time. You know, when you look at Africa's large population, 1.1 billion, it uses the same amount of energy as, say, Germany, one country, about just 83 million people. And also you look at the fact that there are a lot of discoveries of fossil fuel sites across the continent, and people are saying we need to be given the time to use up these things to develop, just like the West has done. And then the argument is as well is always there that even if we fully develop our fossil fuel technology, we probably will not. It will not make much of a dent in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions globally. But I'd like to point out that maybe we should sit back a little and reflect. The challenge is a lot of people mistake the advocacy of maybe climate change activists as pressure from the West. The reality is that Western leaders have identified the pockets of big greenhouse gas emissions across the world. Take the continent away, South Africa, because it relies primarily on coal, is actually one of the biggest polluters globally. Someone put it at number 12, though when you look at per capita, it might be like number 34. And that's why you saw those 1.8 billion funds coming from Western countries at the time. But let's look at it strategically. Africa has strategic advantages that many people in the West, many countries in the West do not have. We have this abundant sunshine and wind energy. You also have to consider the fact that just by itself, funds are drying up to support fossil fuel development and technology. And so what that means is that if we continue to invest in fossil fuel technology and assets, the risk is there that in future we might end up with stranded assets. And also when the funds start drying up, it means research and development in the technology and equipment for these plants are drying up.
Sure.
So it's really a challenge on its own.
And that's all from me for now. It's back to you.
Thanks for the update there, Palesa. Now let's move over to East Africa with Sarah Murungi.
Thank you, Akin. Africa's food systems are facing the triple threat of cost, climate, and conflict, pushing millions of lives and livelihoods into danger. Ridhima Shukla spoke to the new managing director of AGRF to learn about their approach for the year 2023 and the new mechanisms being put in place to navigate through the impending hurdles.
The food crisis, the Ukrainian crisis, climate crisis, you name it. And right now, it calls for urgency, particularly on the African continent. From convening, we would like to go beyond the forum. And what, as the new MD, we are looking for, and also hearing from our partners and our clients, how can we go from convening and facilitating matchmaking to concrete impact on the ground, and to make food system and the continent self-sufficient in food security. So that will call for more actions in terms of financing, but also in terms of hand-holding and all those young people and women at the center of the food system production, food system transformation, to act with resources, but also with knowledge. So as an MD, and bringing all these different platforms. So we would like to be a platform of platforms. So, but at the same time, also a platform of technical assistance that goes beyond the convening, but a platform of financing where we can leverage from our partners' comparative advantage to make this happen. So this is what we would like to bring, not the forum this year, but a long-term vision where for the 5 coming years, we will then move the agenda towards food system transformation.
Right. Now, in the past, AGRF has been able to, it's important that you mentioned financing, and that has consistently not matched what is required, whether it is climate adaptation or private sector financing. So what in the last few AGRFs would you like to really push for further in the coming summits? And as you mentioned, like as the platform that it serves, and what would you probably remove, something that hasn't been working?
Oh, excellent. So I think the past AGRF, we've done very well in terms of convening. The numbers have been growing from 1,000 participants to 2 to 3 to 8,000. So it's been growing over the past years, and despite even, the COVID context. Now, the convening power is there. We have higher political commitment and agenda, which is set. Africa needs to be self-sufficient in terms of feeding its people, but also reversing the import food bill and use that money on development sector. That said, the issue is now how can we move from matchmaking meeting, bringing the private sector, so the demand and the supply. So many young people who are coming to AGRF and also financiers, they met, but we still have challenge to make the deals happen for many reasons. Barriers in terms of getting, for instance, the risk that is there that need to be de-risked, the risk, removing those different barriers to make the private sector coming in and financing, including also green financing to support adaptation in the continent. Supporting also those who have deals through Generation Africa, which is in fact a platform that crowd in, and energize the young and the women to come with deals. We have the Agri Deals Room that nurture those deals, generation of ideas on the table.
In order to avoid the worst climate impacts, the world must cut emissions in half this decade and reach net zero by mid-century. Across all sectors of the global economy, transportation, currently accounting for 15% of the world's greenhouse gas emissions, has a big role to play, according to Dr. Andrew Steer, President and CEO of Bezos Earth Fund, who spoke to CNBC Africa's Eugenia Nangwe earlier on.
Not bear a heavy burden and heavy costs to decarbonize its transport system. Africa needs a good, safe, clean transport system for its own citizens. And the problem at the moment with massive urbanization, which is very exciting economically for Africa, but at the same time it's not so good for air pollution, for example. And so what Africa can do is, to some extent, leapfrog a bit. In the West, for the last 120 years, cities have been designed not for people, but for automobiles and for trucks. And actually now we're realizing that's not necessarily the best way to design a city. Actually, there are better ways where you have more green space, you have better public transport. And as we move now towards costs of electric vehicles that are pretty soon going to be cheaper than the old-fashioned petrol-consuming vehicles, there is an opportunity to move forward. So what we have to be careful about is not to position this decarbonization as, my goodness me, in addition to all of the other challenges we have, that we've just had COVID, we've got serious economic challenges of jobs and youth and education. Now we've got to pour a whole lot more money into decarbonization. We've got to think differently. We've got to think about the whole system.
And certainly that's the situation now, yeah? This is what is the current situation, that a lot of African countries have to now rethink their priorities, especially when it comes to this conversation about, decarbonizing transportation. How do they get a soft landing when it comes to financing these ambitious plans?
Well, there are pots of money available, but they aren't enough. There's the Green Climate Fund. There is funding bilaterally. There is also a voluntary carbon market that could come in in a serious way. There are philanthropies, like I have the privilege of leading the Bezos Earth Fund. It's a $10 billion grant fund whose job is to address the urgent problems of climate change and nature this decade. So I think we need to be creative. I mean, the good news is that the prices of, say, electric vehicles are coming down very rapidly. So take, for example, electric buses. Until 3 years ago, 96% of all electric buses in the world were built in China and mainly used in China. They managed to bring the cost down. There's now a growing number of competitors coming into the market. That in turn is lowering the cost. So for example, in India, they're moving forward very aggressively to electrify buses. And it's a particularly important issue because buses traditionally are diesel, traditionally they are not very well maintained, and they pump out incredibly unhealthy, dangerous fumes, not only outside the bus, but actually a lot of it comes back into the bus. So even in this country, in the United States, poor children from poor counties go to school in diesel buses, breathing extremely unhealthy air. So actually, you want to address the issue to electrify buses primarily from a health standpoint, also from a competitiveness standpoint, because if people are healthier, people can work more productively and so on. But coupled with also the move towards public transportation, we can decongest our roads, coupled with moving towards non-motorized transport, bicycles and so on, we can decongest our roads, which in turn has a huge benefit to the economy. You know, here in the United States, congestion costs $1 trillion a year. That's how expensive it is. The millions and millions of hours that people spend in their automobiles waiting, doing nothing. And so, we have to think just differently from in the past.
That's all for me now. It's back to you, Akin.
Next up, we caught up with Serun Joge, the Cheaper Cash co-founder and CEO, who says the company had only about $1 million held in its Silicon Valley account at the time the bank was taken over by the California regulator. Hence, the company recorded insignificant exposure. Now, Mr. Serun Joge further notes that it is sad to see such a pillar of the startup ecosystem take such a hit. Now, he joined us earlier to discuss the development in the space.
Well, clearly a number of concerns were raised. We had observers out watching the elections themselves. We've heard the other observation reports. We've also seen, though, the outcome of the parallel voter tabulation assessment, which suggests that where there were inconsistencies, they were not material to the overall outcome. What we've done is encourage INEC to look at those procedural issues, particularly ahead of this weekend's elections, which is so important. But I think in the end, and people are rightly going to the courts to test their concerns, we encourage that. That's the right way to do it. And the courts in the end, I think, will decide on those irregularities. But key thing is this weekend and how any irregularities are corrected.
Yeah, because people are keen to know your assessment of the state of the democratic institutions here in Nigeria. You know, we always talk about free, fair and credible elections. Do you think that's we're on that path?
I think Nigeria has come an incredible distance in a short space of time in terms of democracy, and I think the distance travelled is remarkable. And I think if we look at some of the very real improvements in the process overall since '99, they are formidable. I think the challenge now is expectation. Expectations are very high, and rightly so, and people expect the election process to be still better, not least this weekend. So I think that's the real gap at the moment that's to be tested. But I think the emergence of a third-party candidate really improved the quality of the democratic debate and indeed what's expected of Nigerian politicians. And that's the key thing, accountability around Nigerian politicians.
Yeah, because when you look at the pre-election environment, the aim here is to entrench democratic ideals, and we've seen quite a lot play out looking at the pre-election environment, just the environment before the presidential elections, and even building up to the gubernatorial polls here. We've seen quite a lot. Voter intimidation played out here. We've seen some violence. We've seen ballot box snatching. We've seen hate speech. And looking at scenarios here, because I would like to always try to compare, and I'm trying to imagine the scenario where how Britons will react if during the elections in Britain somebody snatched a ballot box.
I mean, it's incomparable in the sense that, our experience of democracy is just over such a longer period of time. Expectations are very different. But any violence, any intimidation, any ballot box snatching is clearly wrong, no question. I think what really concerns me ahead of this weekend is some of the more ethnically charged language that we've heard. I think it's really, really important that all politicians take responsibility, not just for their words, but the words and actions of their campaigners and supporters, and ensure people do the right thing. And the right thing is, frankly, to approach these elections in a calm spirit, non-violent, douse tension, not inflame it, and appeal to people on the basis of what they're going to do for them, not because of their ethnicity or indeed their religion. I think that's something really people should take seriously, not least in Lagos this weekend, but actually across the south of Nigeria.
Yeah, because it's very important for Nigeria to get it right. Because when you look at democracy in West Africa, recently we've seen quite a lot has played out there. We've seen unconstitutional changes in government in different countries here, and for a country like Nigeria, countries who are the foresters of democracy in Africa, we're looking at Nigeria, we're looking at Ghana, and it's very important that we get it here right in Nigeria.
Absolutely. I mean, Nigeria's democracy is an example to others in West Africa of what to do, what not to do. The impact on West Africa's economy, on West Africa culturally, massive, significant. I think the key thing I would say is it's a good thing expectations of voters are high. Voters should vote. I mean, voter turnout was low on the 25th. I think on the 18th, let's see more people vote, more people participate, more people make their voice heard. I think that's a really good sign for West African democracy too. But really, really important that people participate. I think that's a really important part of what's happening.
Yeah, but to address voter apathy, transparency and the process needs to be clear and spelled out. And when you look at the election process here, the introduction of technology was supposed to be that game changer here. But sadly, we saw that didn't really meet up to expectations. But, I'd like you to speak to that importance of having transparent processes so that the outcomes will not be disputed as we're seeing play out here.
I think the technology worked in some respects. So in terms of accreditation, I think it did reduce the amount of overvoting that was seen, particularly if you look at voter turnouts back to 99, the voter turnout is lower now, but perhaps it's more reflective of one person, one vote. I think that's a really, really important part. Where it did not work as well, and we lobbied INEC on that straight after the election, was the transparency around transmission of results or sending of results through to the AGRF portal. Really, really important that's corrected for the 18th. Really important. I think INEC have taken very seriously the need for greater transparency around that. But I was in a Kiti, an off-cycle election. I saw the technology work in both senses, and I think it's really important on the 18th to scale we see it work again.
Next up, we caught up with Ham Serunjoge, the Cheaper Cash co-founder and CEO, who says the company had only about $1 million held in its Silicon Valley account at the time the bank was taken over by the California regulator. Hence, the company recorded insignificant exposure. Now, Mr. Serunjoge further notes that it is sad to see such a pillar of the startup ecosystem take such a hit. Now, he joined us earlier to discuss the development in the space.
Both Silvergate Bank and Silicon Valley Bank going down in the same week, within days of each other, has been chaotic for the entire tech industry and Silicon Valley at large. So those are the kind of events in an industry that shake everyone and create a bunch of uncertainty.
Yes.
But for us specifically at Chipper, as I said in my statement a few days ago, we were fortunate that most of our money was held elsewhere. We only had about $1 million of total exposure in our Silicon Valley Bank account at the time that the bank got shut down last week. So in the worst case scenario, losing that amount of money would have been insignificant to us, given our global operations and that most of our money is elsewhere. But fortunately, and for all people who are depositing money at Silicon Valley Bank, the government stepped in very quickly over the weekend, and every deposit has been made whole. So everyone who had money there still has that money, and they've been able to access it. So there was eventually no impact at all to anyone, thankfully.
The ripples are still being felt. Take, for example, oil prices have dipped just because of this news. We're also seeing this possibly as a driver for crypto assets and how this would also likely prop up beyond just the tech ecosystem and what this portends. But I would like to get some clarification and take you on your last note. According to the FDIC, it earlier mentioned that by Monday would have confirmation of at least half of the amount in the SVB account. Have you received that yet?
Yeah, that was before the Secretary of the Treasury had come on Sunday and made a very firm statement that all deposits will be guaranteed. Prior to her statement, at that time, the FDIC was insuring up to $250,000 for every depositor. And the way we had held our money in the account meant that we could access up to about $500,000 altogether of the million that we had in SVB. So we had confirmation that we could get up to half of our money in a worst case scenario by Monday. But given the statement that the bank is fully guaranteed with depositors' money all being available, we actually have access to all of our money now, and we got access to it on Monday. So ourselves and pretty much anyone else who wanted to take their money out when Monday opened was able to do so. So all those funds are fully accessible to ourselves and to everyone else who was backing there, which is ultimately the most important thing, because as you mentioned, one of the fallouts of this whole crisis is that if there's a lack of confidence in the financial systems and the banking system, that sort of creates a domino effect, where you see people lose confidence across the board, and you will see even more runs on banks happening. So this really, really strong statement and move by the government to back every single depositor fully has really helped and restored a significant amount of confidence in the banking industry. So that was key to, I think, containing the fallout that could have been much, much worse if that guarantee wasn't made.
Yes, these are still uncertain days, but at the initial news of the fallout, we had sharks coming to bear. But now, correct me if I'm wrong, about 2% of Chipper is owned by SVP. What happens next with that percentage?
Yeah, this is a great point. So Silicon Valley Bank was both a banking partner for us, but they also have an arm that invests in businesses called Silicon Valley Bank Capital. Okay. And that arm was an investor in Chipper. They participated and led our Series C round, where we raised $100 million. That round included a number of other investors, so they didn't do it by themselves. And so Silicon Valley Bank Capital, the arm that invested in Chipper, owns about 2% of our company right now. So in terms of what happens to that stake, it still is owned by that entity. And one of the very key things that I think anyone who sort of digs deeper into understanding the structure of that bank and how it operates will see is that regardless of what happened to the bank, the capital arm was a separate pool of funds that was unaffected. But now even more so that the bank is back to being operational and it's backed by the FDIC, that stake is still owned by the capital arm. Those interests are theirs. To us, there's no financial effect because we received those funds already. That's one of the points I made in my statement.
That's it from West Africa. Thank you, Palesa and Sarah, for the regional updates from Eastern and Southern Africa. Oh, well, that's all we can take on this week's episode of African Business Weekly. Join us same time next week for more weekly business stories across sub-Saharan Africa. I'm Akion Bakeye. Thanks for watching.